and welcome back to another episode of I'm Free Now What with me, Michelle Fortier. Today I'm going to talk about my DBT journey and the way that I worked in the Florida Department of Corrections. So I did not start out as a DBT provider. I was very much a behaviorist though. I would look at behaviors as getting needs met. And so when inmates would act out, I would say, what is behind this behavior? There was somebody that was much higher up than me that basically thought that these behaviors were some intrinsic thing that was occurring within themselves. And I'd worked with inmates long enough to know that they were generally up to something. The thing is, though, is when they were up to something, I did not take it as something nefarious or something that they shouldn't be doing. We all attempt to get our needs met. And in the prison environment, there's a limited way to get your needs met effectively. And a lot of times those things are not available to inmates because of literacy issues, impulse control issues, difficulty with relationships, difficulty with tolerating distress. And so I always felt I needed to figure out why they were getting into trouble, why they were doing these behaviors, and what they could do instead. My line with inmates was always, is this behavior getting you closer to coming back to prison, or is it getting it further away from coming back to prison? I always would tell inmates, my job is to do mental health in the prison environment. However, my calling is to do the things and teach you the things necessary for you to stay out of prison. One of the ways that I would be able to work with inmates is I would reward behaviors that I wanted to see. And the people that I worked with loved time with their mental health person. They absolutely love the opportunity to talk. They love the opportunity to get feedback. They love the opportunity to spend time with a female. And I knew what it was. A lot of them, they have close relationships with females out in the community where they have close relationships with baby mamas, with their moms, with sisters. And so I would see myself in that role. And I would help guide their behaviors so that way they got to the place that they wanted. So I would reward behaviors that I wanted to see by giving more time. And what I mean by that is when inmates would give in inmate requests, I would make sure, because that is the correct way to do things. When we're out here in the free world, we go ahead, we call or we email, and we make an appointment. That's normal. It is not normal or appropriate to just walk into a place and declare that you're going to kill yourself to get services. That's not normal. So I would not reward psych emergencies. They would get 2 minutes for me to evaluate whether or not I truly believed that they were suicidal, that they were going to escalate and needed a Shaw's placement, or if they needed to do things the right way. And when I say the right way, I would encourage them to go back in their cell, write me an inmate request, and I would put them on the next available call out that I had. With psych emergencies, like I said, they would get very little time. If they self-harmed, if they tried to hang themselves, if they tried to kill themselves, it would be maybe a 30-second eval to figure out how serious it was after staffing with everybody else about the seriousness. If I could see that rewarding, that being in a Shaw cell was rewarding, I would make sure that they did not get a placement in a psych cell. That was very important to me if I wanted to break a behavior. And I would work with security on this. I would make sure that they knew what the game plan was. Security generally wants to keep them out of the psych cells. They don't want to do transfers. All of it is labor intensive. So I would tell security, hey, just watch out for this one. I'm trying to break them of this habit. I don't want to reward this behavior. And so when the inmate would show out and keep asking for psych emergencies, I would document on the back of their 229 that this was not true emergencies, that they were doing it in order to get a need met and they needed to do it more appropriately. Now, when they were on the open compound, what I would do on there is instead of declaring a psych emergency, I had an agreement with security staff that an inmate could ask for a pass. And what that would do is the security staff would call me on the telephone and I would say whether or not I had time. And the inmate would come up on a pass, sit in the lobby like a normal human being. And when I had an opening in my schedule, I would call the inmate back and talk to him. in this way, it was a little bit faster to get a need met than an inmate request, but not as disruptive, or in my terms, I know that this is a judgment, but selfish. Psych emergencies are extremely selfish. They are a burden on staff. They're a burden on other inmates that are patiently waiting their turn. They are labor intensive. They just are too much. So I would also, when they would declare psych and it was not a psych emergency as determined by me, they would also get a $5 copay. If they were an S2 and they were doing a walk-in, they wouldn't be charged that $5 because, like I said, I wanted to reward behaviors that I wanted to see and make behaviors that I do want to see be aversive or at least not reinforcing. Now, another big thing that I would do is when I had inmates that I knew were higher risk to go when they went to confinement, that they would generally act out, that there would be something terrible that would happen, all that stuff. I knew those inmates, and when I would get that little staff referral that they had gone to confinement, the first thing that I would do is call down to that confinement unit, and I would go cell front and let that inmate know that I knew he was back there. A lot of times they're afraid that they're going to be forgotten. They've had bad experiences in confinement units. They believe that they're going to be harmed. And them knowing that I was there to watch out and make sure that they were okay really helped calm down a lot of those psych emergencies and problematic behaviors. I worked very closely with classification, security, wardens, assistant wardens. The gang sergeant was a big one. If you don't get along with your gang sergeant or even know who your gang sergeant is, get on that. Your gang sergeant is going to know a lot of the reasons why an inmate is potentially declaring psych and trying to harm himself and all that other stuff. The biggest compliment that I ever got is I had an inmate sitting in a psych cell, and he somehow, some way, surprise, surprise, managed to get a hold of a razor or a sharp object, and they actually carved into the door, "Mrs. Fortier is there to help you if you want the help." That, to me, meant that they knew that I wasn't there to be manipulated, that I wasn't there to be lied to, that if they were honest, I would help them achieve their goals in a pro-social way. The other thing is I saw all the behaviors, like I said, as solving problems. So when they would act out, when they would do these things that were problematic, instead of seeing them as, oh my God, inmate's doing this, I would see it, okay, what is that inmate up to? What do I need to help him cope with? What do I need to do to make suicide, self-harm, disruption, kicking doors, not work to get his needs met, and instead writing a request, talking like a normal human being, how can I get that to get his needs met? So now in terms of DBT in the Department of Corrections, like I said, I was not a DBT provider, just very much a behaviorist. Now, I did take a training with Kathy Moonshine that was held at Lake, and I think this was in 2015. And while I found the training to be somewhat helpful, it was more geared towards the inpatient unit, and at that time, I was working in an outpatient unit. And I've helped at inpatient units, but I've never worked in an inpatient units. One of the other things that I would do to help inmates, keep them busy, keep them focused, keep them doing what they need to do, is I would give out booklets, work booklets for free. I would just print them out from the internet from the Center for Clinical Interventions. They had a really good one called Distress Tolerance. And that one helped people be able to tolerate the thoughts and the emotions and the fears that they had, so that way they could make healthy choices for themselves. Now, the interesting part about all of this is I knew what worked. I had pushback though. Surprise, surprise. DOC giving pushback, who would have thought? So I went and I looked for clinical justification for the way that I handle things. And like I said, I wasn't really that familiar with DBT yet. So I got this great book, Correctional Mental Health Care, and it also had a lot of the different things that I was already doing. So I had the clinical justification when they would say, Michelle, you need to put that one in the psych cell, blah, 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 blah. And I would go over and I would pull from this literature why it was inappropriate to do that. Yes, he said he was going to kill himself. And I also know that that's not what's going to happen. I know it from his past behavior. I know it because of the reasons why he's doing it. I know it because he's already disclosed to other inmates or security staff what he's up to. I had one time that actually wrote a letter home about how he was going to go psych because he owed money on the compound. Security reads the letters. So I already knew what that inmate was up to. So I could stop that, not reward the behavior, and allow him to face his consequences and figure out how to handle things in an appropriate way. Now, the other thing is I would sometimes assist inmates in calming down. I would help coach them through it. I would give them different ways to think, different ways to behave. I kind of in low key would help them breathe. I would help them problem solve. And I would do this before it was a psych emergency or a crisis intervention. When I was called for a crisis intervention, at that point, things had escalated to a point where they needed those consequences. For my professional opinion, they did not need a mental health professional coming in and saving the day and saving them from their consequences. So I would go over, and I really truly perceived that some of them, I would call it that they would spin up, and the only way that they could spin back down is to be, have their use of force. What I found is when I was talking them out of it, about an hour or two later, they would escalate back up again. And what I knew is they were, what do they call it? Booing themselves up. They would sit in that cell and go, oh man, this. And they would get themselves all aggravated again and start kicking the door. So I found that when I was talking them out of it, I was just delaying the inevitable. So I would go over, I would do my little crisis intervention, and the inmates themselves know, oh, Miss Fortier is here. I already know what time it is. And they would be sitting there putting their shirt in the cold water and putting it over themselves so that way they could avoid the gas and make it not so bad. And I also didn't do the crisis intervention because it had gotten to a point where that would have been rewarding. They would have known, oh, Mrs. Fortier is going to come over with this crisis intervention. Let me get everybody ready to gas me. And then I'm going to go ahead and calm down because now I got everybody's attention. That was not going to happen. They had the opportunity long beforehand to calm down, and they chose not to. So at that point, I didn't feel it was appropriate to my long-term goal of them learning better behaviors to reward that behavior. There was pushback. Some people thought it was mean, blah, 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 blah. And the feedback that I also got from inmates after I would pull them out because after use of force, you have to see the inmate, they understood and they were appreciative of the way that I handled it. They understood why I did it that way. They understood that this was their consequence, that I wasn't going to save them from it. And so there wasn't this kind of pushback from the inmates, which I always found interesting. All the things that I always did was in the best interest of all the inmates that I worked with. It was very important to me that they learn skills to stay out of prison. So I didn't learn much DBT while I was in there, except for that one training. However, at my core, I was practicing DBT without even knowing it. I was radically accepting inmates where they were. I was understanding that I needed to validate them, understand where they were coming from. I understood that suicide attempts and self-harm were different ways to solve problems, and I would help them address what the problem is. So then once I left the prison, I took this DBT skills training and it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, I needed this in the prison system. And I found it to be incredibly helpful. And it spoke to me in who I am and how I practice. DBT is a much more directive therapy. And I found that with inmates, there was this need to be directive. Person-centered, all well and good, but if you don't have the skills inherently within you, what are we doing, right? So I would teach them how to make pro-social decisions. I would teach them by doing pros and cons. I would teach them by pointing out potential consequences and whether or not they wanted those consequences. And if you don't want those consequences, what do you need to do to change what you're doing? And that is a lot of DBT. So I learned more and more about DBT. I started providing a DBT skills group. I then learned how to provide individual DBT. I then became part of a consultation team. And then after doing all that, I then also took a training through PESI. I call that, no offense to them, but I call that like the Walmart version. So I took the Walmart version, very basic. I learned some, but not that much. And then I also then took the PsychWire training. That one is like, I don't know, the Neiman Marcus, the Nordstrom, the, what is that really expensive place in New York City, whatever that one is, it's that one. I mean, it was high quality and I learned a lot. So I took that one from PsychWire. And then I also took adolescent DBT through PsychWire. And I also took DBT with couples, families, and parents with Dr. Alan Frusetti. And those things, it really resonates with what is the most effective that I have found. And remember, I had a very low CSU transfer rate, self-harming, cut way down. I had 2 inmates that were in psych cells next to each other and were in a race to see who could get the most stitches in a weekend. I got both of them to stop self-harming. And one of the inmates was the one that wrote that thing on the door. The other inmate was one where he told the senior, he said, Mrs. Fortier, she really cares. She's crazy now, but she really cares about us and she's really helpful. I really took that to heart. And another inmate that was doing all this self-harm, he actually gave me a Mother's Day card, which I felt very, very nice about, that he saw me as somebody helpful, somebody that was guiding him and moving him in the direction that he needed to go in. So that's how I got into doing DBT out here, and my behaviorism in the Florida Department of Corrections, and how that worked for me. And this is one of the resources that I found incredibly helpful to justify the interventions that I was doing. There's also this curriculum from Kathy Moonshine. Like I said, it really didn't apply too much to me. I feel like maybe if I was doing inpatient, it would have applied more. And the handouts were, they didn't really explain how to use the handouts. I didn't feel like it was the greatest training. I don't know how other people felt about it. And the other one that I used was handouts, workbooks from the Center for Clinical Intervention, and I will post that link for that website below. The handouts were free, and so I would give them to inmates in confinement, because while they're on confinement, they are allowed to get mental health handouts. I would also get cheap books from the thrift store on different mental health topics, and I would put on there Return to Mental Health. These are Mrs. Fortier's books, and they were allowed to have them on confinement units because they were mental health related. And so I would try as much as possible to use their time in confinement wisely, and I would give them resources that would help them learn how to manage their behaviors more effectively. And that is my journey into behaviorism, into DBT. And the next video, I'm going to go over what DBT is and how to potentially apply it effectively in the prison environment. Take care.